In the scorching heat of June 1945, under the relentless Okinawa sun, a moment was about to unfold in a makeshift prisoner of war camp that would challenge everything anyone thought they knew about duty, compassion, and what it truly means to be human in the middle of war. Sergeant James Crawford had seen more horror in 3 years than most people witness in a lifetime. His face carved with lines that belonged to someone twice his age, hardened by campaigns through Guadalcanal, Saipan, and finally Okinawa, but somewhere deep inside, that Iowa farm boy still existed, still remembered his mother's final words before he shipped out. Never lose your humanity no matter what you see. The Battle of Okinawa had just ended, leaving over 100,000 Japanese military casualties and forcing thousands of civilians into American custody. And the prisoner camps were hastily thrown together, overcrowded, stretched beyond their limits with scarce medical supplies, few interpreters, and constant misunderstandings between two cultures that had been at war for years. Crawford walked his daily patrol through the civilian detention area where Japanese nurses, teachers, shopkeepers, and farmers waited for processing. People who never wanted this war but found themselves consumed by it anyway. And among them sat Yuki Yamamoto, 24 years old, a civilian nurse whose dark eyes stayed fixed on the ground as pain grew sharp and insistent in her abdomen. She had served in a field hospital until American forces overran their position 3 weeks earlier, and now dressed in a torn traditional dress, she was just another nameless prisoner. But she recognized her own symptoms from medical training, appendicitis, and without treatment she knew exactly what would happen: peritonitis, sepsis, death. She had seen it happen to soldiers on both sides, but how could she communicate this to guards who spoke no Japanese when she knew only a handful of English words? Private Danny Martinez, fresh-faced at 21 and just 4 days into his first real deployment, carried a small notebook documenting everything he saw, convinced that future generations would need to understand what really happened in these camps. His camera hanging around his neck, a prized possession and a promise to his mother that he would record the truth whatever that turned out to be. Lieutenant Samuel Parker had been a doctor in a quiet Boston suburb before Pearl Harbor changed everything. And now at 35 he ran medical operations for the entire detention facility, constantly deciding who would receive treatment and who would have to wait. The ethical compromises wearing on him daily, while Captain William Thompson commanded the camp with an iron fist guided by strict regulation. At 42, he was too old for frontline combat, but too experienced to waste. His interpretation of the Geneva Convention was literal: prisoners received adequate food, water, and shelter according to minimum standards. Nothing more, nothing less. He had seen too many American boys die to waste sympathy on the enemy, even if that enemy now sat unarmed behind barbed wire. Dr. Helen Morrison was different, a Navy nurse who volunteered for the Pacific Theater and spent 2 years moving from island to island treating wounded Marines under fire. And at 31 she had learned basic Japanese and started seeing prisoners not as enemies but as human beings caught in the machinery of war. And it was Morrison who first noticed something was terribly wrong when during a routine health inspection she observed Yuki doubled over, sweat pouring down her face despite the shade. Morrison knelt beside her speaking slowly in broken Japanese, and Yuki managed to gasp out a single word, appendix, then pointed to her lower right abdomen and made a cutting motion, and Morrison's blood ran cold because she had seen appendicitis progress to rupture before, and if that happened here in these conditions without immediate surgery, this young woman would die within days. Morrison ran to find Lieutenant Parker, her boots kicking up dust as she navigated between tents, finding him treating a soldier for an infected wound, and she quickly explained the situation, watching his expression shift from concern to grim calculation because they had limited surgical supplies, no proper operating theater, and a camp commander who would question every deviation from standard procedure. But they both knew the Hippocratic Oath didn't recognize nationality or military status. Parker grabbed his medical bag and followed Morrison back to where Yuki lay, performing a quick examination, pressing gently on her abdomen, and when he released the pressure, suddenly Yuki screamed, rebound tenderness, the definitive sign of acute appendicitis, and Parker checked his watch knowing they had maybe 12 to 18 hours before rupture became likely, and after that her chances of survival would drop dramatically. The problem was immediate and obvious. Yuki's traditional Japanese dress was a complex garment wrapped and tied in ways Parker and Morrison didn't understand, and to examine her properly, to confirm the diagnosis and prepare for emergency surgery, they needed access to her abdomen. But the dress was designed to preserve modesty with multiple layers and intricate fastenings, and simply asking her to remove it would be culturally traumatic, especially with male soldiers present. And they didn't have time for gentle negotiations through broken language barriers. Parker made the decision. They would need to cut away enough of the dress to perform the examination and surgery if necessary. But he needed someone he trusted, someone who could act quickly and follow orders without hesitation. So he sent Morrison to find Sergeant Crawford, who had a reputation as a solid NCO, calm under pressure, and most importantly someone who could follow difficult orders without letting emotion cloud judgment. Crawford was checking supply inventories when Morrison found him and quickly explained the situation, Parker's orders, and what would be required, and Crawford felt his stomach tighten because this wasn't combat. This was something far more complicated. He would be asked to physically restrain a terrified prisoner and tear her clothing, and even with medical justification, even with witnesses present, it felt wrong. But he had been in the Pacific long enough to know that war constantly forced impossible choices. They returned to where Yuki lay, now barely conscious from pain. Parker had already briefed Captain Thompson, who grudgingly approved the emergency medical procedure, but insisted everything be documented and witnessed. So Private Martinez was ordered to photograph the process, creating a visual record that would protect everyone involved from later accusations of misconduct. And Martinez swallowed hard but readied his camera, because this was the kind of truth he hadn't expected to document. Parker knelt beside Yuki and spoke slowly, using hand gestures to communicate. He pointed to her abdomen, made a cutting motion, then pointed to the medical tent, and Yuki's eyes widened with understanding and fear because she knew what they intended to do, but she also understood why. She had been a nurse, she knew her own symptoms, and she gave a small nod with tears streaming down her face, granting permission in the only way she could. Crawford positioned himself beside her, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his mind, and Parker gave the order. Crawford grasped the fabric of Yuki's dress at the lower section and pulled sharply, and the sound of tearing cloth seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence as other prisoners nearby gasped, and some cried out in protest, not understanding what was happening, while American soldiers moved to keep order, creating a perimeter around the medical team. The torn fabric revealed Yuki's swollen abdomen, and Parker immediately resumed his examination, now able to palpate the area properly. Feeling the rigid abdomen, the guarding of muscles, and the mass in the lower right quadrant, his diagnosis confirmed. Without surgery in the next few hours, this young woman would die. And he looked up at Crawford and nodded, because Crawford had done what was necessary. The shocking moment captured in Martinez's photograph would be explained by the medical emergency, not by cruelty or malice. They moved Yuki to the medical tent on a stretcher, with Morrison running ahead to prepare the makeshift operating area. Parker scrubbed his hands with precious disinfectant while Crawford and Martinez helped secure the space, and Captain Thompson watched from the entrance, his expression unreadable because this was unprecedented, using limited medical resources on enemy prisoners when American soldiers might need those same supplies. But even Thompson understood that some lines once crossed would haunt a man forever. The surgery lasted 3 hours, with Parker working with the concentration of a man defusing a bomb. Each cut and suture a battle against infection and time, Morrison assisted with practiced efficiency, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, and they had caught it just in time. The appendix was inflamed and beginning to show signs of early rupture, but the infection hadn't spread. They removed it cleanly, irrigated the cavity, and closed the incision with careful stitches. Crawford waited outside the tent with Martinez, neither man speaking, listening to the clink of instruments, the low murmur of voices, and occasionally Yuki's groans as the limited anesthesia wore thin, and Crawford thought about his mother again, about her faith that good men would do good things even in the worst circumstances, hoping she was right, hoping this moment would be remembered as an act of mercy, not a violation. When Parker emerged 3 hours later, his surgical gown soaked with sweat and blood, his expression carried grim satisfaction. She would live, with proper post-operative care and assuming no complications. Yuki Yamamoto would recover fully, and he looked at Crawford and extended his hand. Crawford shook it with understanding, passing between them without words because they had bent the rules, ignored protocol, and risked their careers to save a single enemy prisoner, and they would do it again if necessary. The story might have ended there, buried in camp records and forgotten in the chaos of war's end, but Private Martinez had documented everything with his camera and notebook, and the photograph of Crawford tearing Yuki's dress, taken out of context, looked damning. A large American soldier violently ripping the clothing of a helpless Japanese woman. Without explanation, it appeared to be exactly the kind of war crime that military tribunals were being established to prosecute. But Martinez's complete documentation told the real story: the medical emergency, Parker's examination, the diagnosis, the life-saving surgery, the follow-up care over the following weeks, and as Yuki recovered, Martinez interviewed everyone involved, recording their statements in his careful handwriting because he understood that history would judge this moment, and he wanted the judgment based on truth, not assumption. Word of the incident spread through the camp, reaching both prisoners and soldiers. The Japanese prisoners, who had initially reacted with horror, gradually learned what had actually happened. And Yuki, once she recovered enough to speak, explained to her fellow prisoners that the Americans had saved her life, that the soldier who tore her dress had done so not from cruelty but from necessity, that they had treated her with more care than she had any right to expect as a prisoner of war, and Dr. Morrison visited Yuki daily during her recovery. Through their limited shared vocabulary and elaborate hand gestures, a friendship formed. Morrison learned about Yuki's medical training and her dreams of returning to school after the war, while Yuki learned about Morrison's life in America and her hope that medicine could bridge the divides that war had created. 3 weeks after the surgery, Yuki was strong enough to walk without assistance, and she asked Morrison to arrange a meeting with Sergeant Crawford through an interpreter because she wanted to thank him properly. Crawford was reluctant, uncomfortable with being called a hero for doing what anyone would have done. But he agreed to meet her, and they sat in the medical tent with the interpreter between them, translating carefully as Yuki spoke at length, explaining her gratitude, her understanding of how difficult his decision must have been, and her belief that he had demonstrated true courage by valuing her life despite the circumstances. Crawford listened, his face reddening with embarrassment, trying to deflect, to explain that Lieutenant Parker deserved the credit, that he had only followed orders, but Yuki insisted because she understood military hierarchy. She knew that Crawford could have refused, could have questioned the order, could have performed his duty with cruelty instead of care, but he had chosen differently, and Captain Thompson, witnessing this exchange, felt something shift in his rigid worldview because he had built his career on following regulations, on maintaining clear lines between friend and enemy, us and them. But watching this Japanese nurse thank an American sergeant for saving her life, he recognized the inadequacy of his previous understanding. War created enemies, but it didn't erase humanity. Protocol had its place, but so did mercy. The war ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's unconditional surrender, and the prisoner camps began processing releases, sending Japanese nationals back to their devastated homeland. Yuki was among those released in September, her surgical scar hidden beneath her clothing, but her memory of the Americans who saved her life carried visibly in her changed perspective, and before she left, she gave Morrison a small gift, a carefully folded origami crane made from scrap paper. Because in Japanese tradition the crane symbolized hope and healing, Morrison accepted it with tears in her eyes, promising to remember Yuki and to work toward a world where nurses could simply be nurses caring for the sick regardless of nationality or politics. The years passed. Crawford returned to Iowa after his discharge in December 1945 and never spoke much about the war. Like so many veterans of his generation, the horrors he had witnessed, the friends he had lost, the moral compromises he had made, all of it remained locked away. But sometimes late at night he would think about that day in the Okinawa camp, about the sound of tearing fabric and the young woman's life hanging in the balance. And in those moments he allowed himself to believe that he had done something right in a war full of wrong. While Yuki completed her medical education after the war, becoming a doctor specializing in emergency medicine, building a practice in Tokyo, and spending her career advocating for international medical cooperation and understanding, the scar on her abdomen a permanent reminder of the day when enemy soldiers had chosen to save her life. In 1978, a historian researching American occupation policies came across Martinez's report in the National Archives. The photographs and detailed documentation intrigued her, and she tracked down everyone involved, finding that most were still alive. Lieutenant Parker, now a respected surgeon in Boston, Dr. Morrison running a medical mission in Southeast Asia, Captain Thompson retired in Florida, Private Martinez, a journalism professor in California, Sergeant Crawford still farming in Iowa, and Yuki Yamamoto, now Yuki Tanaka, after marriage, and the historian brought them together for a documentary project, filming interviews with each participant. And for the first time in over 3 decades, Crawford and Yuki met again. Both in their 50s now, with graying hair and faces lined by time, but the recognition was immediate. And through a skilled interpreter, they finally had a complete conversation. Yuki told Crawford how that moment had shaped her entire career, how she had devoted her life to medicine because she had seen its power to transcend conflict. And Crawford, uncomfortable with emotion even after all these years, simply said he was glad she had survived, that she had built a good life. And the documentary crew captured it all. The awkward reunion transformed into something profound by the weight of shared history. And when the documentary aired, it challenged simplistic narratives about the Pacific War, showing American soldiers and Japanese prisoners not as monolithic enemies, but as individuals capable of both terrible violence and unexpected compassion. The image of Crawford tearing Yuki's dress, which could have been used as evidence of American war crimes, instead became a powerful symbol of medical ethics transcending national boundaries. And the story spread beyond the documentary, covered in newspapers and magazines, discussed in classrooms and military ethics courses, becoming a case study in medical ethics, cross-cultural communication, and the individual choices that collectively define wartime conduct. While the children and grandchildren of those involved learned about this chapter in their family histories, Crawford's daughter gaining new understanding of her father's silence about the war, and Yuki's children learning that their very existence was owed to split-second decisions of foreign soldiers who could easily have let her die. When Crawford died in 1994, Yuki traveled to Iowa for the funeral, standing in the small country church, speaking about a moment of grace in the middle of war, about an Iowa farm boy who had the courage to make a difficult choice when it would have been easier to look away. And when Yuki passed in 2007, Crawford's children attended her funeral in Tokyo, bringing with them the origami crane she had given to Dr. Morrison, which Morrison had bequeathed to the Crawford family before her own death. The crane, faded and fragile, was placed in Yuki's casket, a symbol completing its journey across decades and oceans. In Okinawa, where that prisoner camp once stood, there is now a memorial park, and among the monuments to battle and sacrifice there is a small plaque telling the story of Sergeant Crawford and Yuki Yamamoto. It doesn't glorify war or ignore its horrors. Instead, it offers a simple reminder that medical ethics, human decency, and the choice to value life can persist even in the darkest circumstances. And the photograph that Private Martinez took that day is now housed in the National Archives, and the Okinawa Peace Museum, always displayed with complete documentation, ensuring that viewers understand the context, the medical emergency, and the life that was saved, because the shocking image becomes something different when the reason is known. Evidence that in a war defined by dehumanization and mass death, individual acts of humanity still occurred. The story asks us to consider what we would do in similar circumstances. When duty and humanity conflict, which do we choose? When resources are scarce and decisions must be made about who receives care, how do we decide? When the enemy is suffering before us, do we see an enemy or a patient? These questions don't have easy answers, but the story of the torn dress suggests that our answers define us more than any military victory or defeat. And in the end, the shocking reason that Sergeant Crawford tore the dress of a Japanese woman prisoner of war was the simplest and most profound reason possible: to save her life. No complexity, no ulterior motive, no political calculation, just a medical emergency, limited time, and the choice to act. And in a war that claimed millions of lives through deliberate violence, this moment stood apart. A life being saved through deliberate compassion. A torn dress that became a symbol not of violation but of healing. Not of the divisions between enemies but of the common humanity that war tries but fails to completely destroy. And if this story resonates with you, if it challenges your understanding of war and humanity, if it reminds you that individuals matter even in the midst of mass conflict, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. How would you have acted in Crawford's position? What does this story teach us about medical ethics in wartime? And stay tuned for more untold stories of courage, compassion, and human complexity from World War II and beyond.